So good afternoon once again. Here we are at Vine Evangelical Church here in Sevenoaks, and today sitting on the couch waiting to be interviewed, I beg your pardon, by myself is Chris Stiven, and Chris has been a member of the church family here for some 20 plus years now. And an elder, Chris, I guess that's by experience, not by your age, of course, for about the last 15 years.
That's right.
So, whereas previously I've started off these interviews by asking people to give us a flavour, an idea of their background, we've had some powerful and interesting stories. And today will be no less interesting at all, because from what I know about Chris, he's had a very colourful and interesting upbringing. So perhaps, Chris, we could just start you off from there. Can you give us in a nutshell some idea about your upbringing and that?
Well, I think my upbringing was possibly typical of certain people of my generation. My parents were living abroad in what was at that time India. I was actually conceived in India just before it became Pakistan, because my parents lived in the northwest, and delivered, however, in the UK whilst my parents were on home leave. So as a baby I went by boat.
So truly multicultural, even at a very, very early age.
Went by boat to what later became Pakistan, and lived there for the first 6.5 years of my life. Allegedly, I was fluent, as a child can be, in Urdu at that age, although I've forgotten most of that now. And then I came back to England, as many did, at the age of 7, to go to boarding school.
And was this with your family, or?
No, my father had home leave every 3 years, so that was impossible. I stayed with my aunt, my mother's sister. Rather interesting. She had 5 children of her own. Okay. She had been married twice. Both husbands had died, so she was a single mum with 5 children. Wow. Nevertheless, took me and my brother in, and so there were 7 of us during the school holidays, okay. And sometimes 10, because my mother's other sister had 3 children who also stayed with us some of the time. Wow,
she certainly had her hands full at the time then. So, can you remember, Chris, going back that time, how you felt about being exported to the UK to go to school without your parents, without your mum and dad?
Well, it's one of those things that when you think about it, sounds odd, but actually, for me, that was just the way things were. You take life as it comes. It's not something I would want for my own children, but actually I didn't mind it. Of course, the result was that I had very little relationship with my parents, either my mother or my father. Yeah. More of a relationship with my aunt. But that's just the way it was.
Okay, so you're 7 years old. You're going to boarding school. And tell us about that. What did you like about boarding school, and how did you find it?
Well, I must admit, the first 2 or 3 terms at boarding school, I would cry myself to sleep in the first few days. But after a while, you really get into it. I didn't mind it at all. Actually, I quite liked it. You got told what to do, you were looked after, you knew what you were supposed to do. As it happened, I was pretty good at most of the stuff that I was expected to do. I was reasonable at sports, I was reasonable academically, except in geography, and so I got on fairly well.
Yeah, okay.
You might find it a little odd, but at that school we didn't use our first names, we used our family names. So I was called Stiven, and when my brother, who was 4 years younger than me, went to the same school, he was Stiven 2 and I was Stiven 1. And that's how I addressed him.
Yeah.
Stiven 2.
Stiven 2.
Except
right.
in the holidays.
So what time did you... So you stayed at boarding school for how many years then?
Well, I was at boarding school until I was 17 or 18. I mean,
so
I went all the way through.
10+ years.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then what happened after that?
Well, then I was going to go to university. I got some pretty good A-levels, or actually S-levels as they were called at the time. I was good at languages, I enjoyed languages, and I wanted to do Russian and French at university. So I actually thought, although I'd done German and French at school, I thought German's actually too easy. That's how arrogant I was. So I'd like to try something that's a bit more of a challenge. So I thought I'll do Russian.
Yeah.
When I interviewed at Oxford, they said, "How much Russian do you know?" I said, "None." They said, "Well, take a year off and go and learn some before you start."
Wow.
So I had a year in Paris living with a Russian family, which enabled me to, brush up on my French and learn a bit of Russian at the same time.
So what was the desire to learn these languages?
I think that was what I was best at. I wasn't very good at any of the sciences at the time, or interested. I'm quite interested now, but I wasn't then. History, geography, and so on I wasn't particularly good at. Maths, I was okay, but languages was what really turned me on. I don't know whether it was because I had spent the first 6 years of my life abroad, had actually learned another language in the process. Perhaps that had something to do with it, but I just enjoyed languages.
So what happened then after university? So you've studied now at university.
Yeah.
You've got your degree in French
and Russian.
And Russian.
Russian and French, actually, in that order was the way it was. And so the next thing was to get a job. The main criterion being to get out of the UK. At the time,
what was the reason behind that?
The economic outlook in the UK was not good.
So without giving too much away about your age, can you give us a rough idea? I guess this was post-Second World War, but...
this was the late 60s.
Late 60s.
Late 60s.
Okay.
So about 1968. And I went and took the Foreign Service exams because I wanted to get into the diplomatic service. I wanted to go and be an ambassador somewhere. So I took the exams, which were quite comprehensive. Having a degree helped, but there were more exams, including the sort of country house exam where you go to see whether you know how to hold a knife and fork and that sort of thing. Went through all that and came out with a result which was not totally satisfactory. I passed, but the mark was not sufficient actually to get me into the diplomatic service, only into the home civil service.
That must have been a wrench, because up until now, what I'm sensing is that you've sort of like had I don't know, privileged is the right word, but certainly a period of achievement when everything you turned your hand to, you seem to have the Midas touch, and so this must have been a bit of a wrench for you?
Yes, I mean, looking back on it, God had blessed me with a decent set of brains and decent sporting ability and so on. Nothing exceptional, but pretty decent. And so this was in a sense the first failure. I'd had scholarships and all that sort of thing galore up to that point. Now that was a first setback.
Right.
So my roommate at Oxford said to me, "Why don't you join the Bank of London and South America as another way of getting abroad?" Cut a long story short, I joined them, or at least I applied for a job, got offered it, and I said to them, "Thank you very much for the offer. Do you mind if I defer it for a year, because I want to try for the diplomatic service again?" And they said, "Okay." So I waited a year, had a second gap year post-uni, and I went through the same civil service exams, got the exact same result, joined the bank. The bank had branches in Latin America and Spain and Portugal, and I expected to get sent to Argentina or Brazil or somewhere like that. Instead, I got sent to Japan.
Wow.
Which was great, because...
You said you were very good at geography. Did you know where Japan was?
I think the idea was, they said, you like languages, you've got a degree in Russian, you must be good at languages. How do you like to try Japanese?
But Chris, I cannot imagine any more difficult language in the world than Japanese to learn.
Well, Japanese, it's a funny thing actually. In terms of grammar, Japanese has virtually no grammar. In terms of grammar, Russian is much, much more complicated. But Japanese has other ways of being difficult. I probably shouldn't go into it now, it would take too long. But yeah, Japanese know how to make a language complicated in other ways.
And you mentioned earlier, God gave you some great gifts and that. Where was God in all of your life up until the moment that you're talking about?
Good question.
Were you a church goer, or were you a Christian or an atheist?
I would say, if I was driving my car through life, God was sitting beside me in the passenger seat. Okay. I was driving.
Okay.
He was in the passenger seat. I was aware of God. I was aware of Christianity. From the very beginning of boarding school, we had what was then called scripture. RE as they call it nowadays. We learned all the Bible stories. I knew all the Bible stories very well. I went, as one did at school, went to assemblies. At my first school, we were marched off to the local town church in the mornings on Sunday. We were issued with a threepenny bit, right, and led in crocodile fashion down, a mile or two down to the nearest town, and went to church. That's what we did. And at my public school also, we had a chapel, and there was compulsory chapel. I was a singer. I enjoyed singing, so naturally, being in church for me, that was a big thing. So I was familiar with church. I knew the stories. But did I have any kind of relationship with God? No. Not really. No. You see, I was pretty confident in myself that I was a decent person. I was a good person, actually. That's what I thought.
And also, contrary to popular opinion, I think, some people think, well, they're suffering so much in life, they need God. And I don't hear anything from that about you, Chris. Your life was one of achievement and dare I say it, the self-made man, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, it's embarrassing to admit it, but I thought that, if I went to church, I'd be doing God a favour. That's the way it was, and I certainly didn't feel any need. My life was fine, I enjoyed it. As you said, pretty much everything I turned my hand to worked out well. I had a slight setback with those Foreign Service exams, but I told myself, rightly I think, I would have been desperately bored if I had really joined the diplomatic service. Endless cocktail parties and so on. Yeah. So I was happy.
But going to Japan, I mean, if you didn't understand the language and you couldn't communicate, and from my knowledge of Japan, English is not a widely used language. How did you feel? Were you lonely? How did you sort of overcome that isolation? If that's not a poor choice of words to use.
Yeah, I was a bit lonely actually, because I was living as a student. Although I was being paid for it, I was living as a student in a student dormitory in Kyoto. I was going 3 or 4 hours a day to a language school, one-on-one language school, but the rest of my time, was my own, and I had no friends. I didn't know anybody there. But over time, I got to know people. But yeah, I must admit it was quite.
So how long were you in Japan? Not that stint then?
That time I was in Japan altogether just short of 2 years.
And then what happened after that?
Well, then after that, I went back to England, and my first, what you might call real posting, banking posting, was to America.
Oh, okay.
So I was sent to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for 6 months. Right. And that was great because...
so you weren't actually back in the UK for long then?
No, just for a short stint, yeah. Okay. And America was good because I had a bit of money in my pocket. I was a young man. This was 1972, so I was 26. Had a bit of money in my pocket. I knew a little bit about America, and I thought, well, I'm going to cut a bit of a swathe through the ladies of this town.
I see.
That was the idea, anyway.
Okay. So you were part of the dating game.
That was
quite seriously.
That was the idea. It lasted about a week, because within a week I was invited to a party where I met Sally, who was going to become my wife.
Okay.
And she very
So
swiftly...
you had your eye out for Sally, or did she approach you? How did that work?
The truth of it is that she approached me. The party was in a very strange...
By the way, have you got approval to say this from Sally after you
Well, I do maintain that it is the truth, and she will admit this. Because the party was held in a venue where the band was located several floors down a sort of a spiral concrete ramp and was making the most awful din. I was, as far away from it as I could be, up near the top of the ramp. Sally approached me up the ramp, hotly pursued by a young American man who was after her, and she was trying to escape him. So she came to me as a way of getting away from him. But she came to me. And she engaged me in conversation, and after a few sentences she said to me, "Hey, you talk funny." And I said, "I certainly do talk funny. I'm English, that's all." She said, "You're jagging me." I said, "I beg your pardon?" She said, "You're jagging me." And when I understood that that meant that I was having her on or pulling her leg, I explained to her, showed her my driving license and all the rest of it, and that started a bit of a relationship.
Fantastic. Okay.
So she let me know that she lived in the country, that is to say the countryside. She was only in Pittsburgh because she was at nursing school, and I explained to her that I really missed the English countryside with its greenery. And she said, "Oh, well, maybe you can come up and stay at my parents' place one weekend." I said, "Great, how about this weekend?" And so anyway, one thing led to another, and by the time my 6 months in Pittsburgh were up, I realised that I'd fallen for Sally.
And she for you, hopefully, as well.
And she, I think, for me as well.
Yeah,
so
so what happened then? I mean, I guess you were being called back to the UK, or
no? I still had another year and a half in the States. Actually, after Pittsburgh, it was New York.
Oh, okay.
So in fact, for the next 6 months, I was living by myself in New York while Sally was finishing off her time at the nursing school, and her mother and I were sort of making plans for the wedding, which was in her hometown. So the wedding took place in April 1973, and we got married and then went to live in New York. Fantastic. And that's when a lot of things changed.
What really significantly changed then? I mean,
well, I said that I'd been very familiar with church going, and so I was, but I hadn't been to church since I left university. So
was Sally at church?
Quite a few years. Sally was, her family were Catholic, or rather her father was Catholic, her mother was Lutheran. They were both very devoted to their faith, and Sally had been brought up Catholic. That was the deal back then. If you married a Catholic man, you had to undertake to bring your children up in the Catholic faith. So Sally had been brought up in the Catholic faith. She was very serious about it, but
with you saying God was in your life, but only in the driving seat, it sounded like up until that point there was no serious engagement or commitment. So
not at all.
How did that work out? That must have been a tough conversation with.
Well, I actually, for the first time, saw a family that took devotion to God naturally. It was a natural part of their lives, and that was very impressive to me. So when we went to New York as a newly married couple, and Sally said to me, "By the way, we will be going to church," I said, "Great, that's fine. I'm happy with going to church." I didn't really think anything of it. I was quite happy to go, but I didn't really think it would make much of a difference. And to be honest, I wouldn't say it made a massive difference until we received our next posting with the bank, which was back to Japan.
Wow. Okay. How did Sally feel about that?
That was really something for her because she had essentially not left the States before. So for her first overseas visit, in effect, to be Japan was very tough for her. And sometime you can ask her what it was like when we were first transferred over and I left the hotel room to go to work and she was left by herself with no one to turn to.
But no one to communicate with, really.
No one to communicate with. That was very tough for her.
Yeah.
Of course, I was oblivious to all this at the time.
Okay. So you're now in Japan, and so Sally is a Christian, or as part
Yes.
of the Catholic Church, and you're still, if I can use that word, registered with God, but not committed.
Exactly.
So, tell us about the sort of like the journey that you followed, or the event that happened. I don't know if it was an event that happened or whether it was a process, Chris, that lead you to become the person of faith that you are today.
Well, there was something that happened, but my really coming back to God was not an event. It was not like that. It was something that took quite a long time. I have to say, Sally, although brought up Catholic, was not enamoured of the sort of what I would call the paraphernalia of Catholicism. She had a faith in Christ, quite irrespective of the Catholic Church. And so we actually went, when we were in Tokyo, to the Tokyo Union Church, which was an English-speaking Protestant church. Ecumenical in the sense of non-denominational, but not really Catholic. And Sally was very happy with that because her relationship was with Christ, not with the Pope or with the church. And it was a church, it was kind of like a club also for English-speaking people. So again, I was quite comfortable going there. But one...
as I guess she was,
totally.
To be within a community of people. Yeah.
But one day I went down to the church library and I came across a book. I won't go into it because the book itself I wouldn't recommend now. But the book got me thinking. And it got me looking at other books. And as a result, I discovered C.S. Lewis. And if you haven't read any C.S. Lewis, I want to recommend it right away. Because the first thing that reading C.S. Lewis...
And by the way, just for the viewers here, any recommendation that Chris makes, I can personally testify that it's seriously worth taking a note of, because Chris has mentioned some books to me and they've had a powerful impact. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ian. Well, I guess the thing that really struck me initially about from reading C.S. Lewis was this. He presented Christianity as something to be believed because it was true. That was a complete revelation to me. I hadn't the slightest conception of Christianity being about truth. I thought Christianity was about being good or being nice to each other.
Or a great story.
A good story, certainly. Yeah. But and it's not that I thought it to be untrue, actually. It's just I never thought of it in terms of truth. I thought of it in terms of, here was somebody who's, telling us how to be good, and let's try to follow him. And, I thought I could do that to some extent. I thought, in fact, I was doing a pretty good job of it. So that was the first thing. I found out how good it is that Christianity is actually true. And by the way, I didn't just take that at face value. I investigated that. Yeah. For years following, I investigated the truth of Christianity, and I found it to hold water completely. So that's the first thing. the second thing was that I found out how untrue it was that Christianity is about being good. You see, I thought I was pretty good. I was certainly good enough. Certainly if I compared myself with some of the other people I knew, I was pretty good. You know? Good enough for God, I thought. And I realized, or I began to realize, again, partly through reading C.S. Lewis, I began to realize that far from being good enough for God, I really wasn't a good person at all. And
could you expand on that without embarrassing yourself? You know, I've heard nothing that suggests you'd be a bad man. So, what do you mean by there was nothing good about you?
I wouldn't say there was nothing good about me, because I would now say I'm created by God, and there is something good about me because God's creation is good. But it was very much stained and tarnished, and there's plenty of things in my life which I'm sorry I'm not going to tell you about, not because they were desperately bad. You know, I haven't murdered, I haven't
robbed a bank, yeah.
But I would be quite embarrassed to tell you some of the ways in which I've treated other people, but that's not really what I'm getting at, though, when I say that I wasn't good enough. I just, the first commandment says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. I didn't love God. I loved me. That's who I loved. Yeah. I didn't actually allow God to be God. I talked about having God in the passenger seat while I was driving. That's basically it. I thought, I might get some good advice from him, but I was going to be doing the driving. And it took me, I don't know how many years. I mean, to be honest, it probably took me at least 20 years after that for me gradually to allow God to change places with me, and for him to become the driver and for me to become the passenger. And in fact, I have to say, even now, and it's been many years since then, even now, I have to keep reminding myself who's in the driving seat.
That's powerful, Chris, because I think a lot of people would, they've got a vision of something like a Billy Graham type concert where, they'll go to a concert and they'll walk in a civilian and they'll come out a Christian, something hit them that night. But you're saying it took you 20 years to finally reach a place where you were comfortable.
20 years plus, even when having investigated the truth about Christianity, I was fully convinced, totally convinced, and remain fully convinced, and have been increasingly convinced as time goes on. Even when I was fully convinced, actually taking that step of allowing God into the driver's seat was a different thing.
Has it been worth it?
Long time. Oh, most definitely. Definitely true. I couldn't. I could never go back. But I can't recollect any moment when I said, this is it. I know. Yes, I prayed the prayer. More than once. I prayed the prayer, definitely. But I could never say, up until this point I wasn't a Christian, and from this point onwards I became a Christian. I can't really point to such a time. All I can point to is that there's been a gradual progression over the years, a growing in maturity and understanding, and a growing in submission to God, I guess.
And that journey started, we don't know where it started, really. Japan, because you've lived in Brazil as well, haven't you, as well, for a number of years?
Brazil, Panama as well, States again.
Okay. So, Chris, I think what we're going to do now is slowly to wrap our conversation up. Interesting though it is, I could just go on for a much longer time hearing about your story, because it is so full of intrigue and that. There's probably people out there, maybe like yourself, who going through life who are satisfied with their lot. They've got no dissatisfaction, so they haven't got a need for God. I mean, what would you What would you say to people like that who might be watching, not only from our own community within Vine Evangelical Church, but maybe beyond that in the UK or even the rest of the world? What would you say to those types of people in that quandary?
Life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions or in the quality of your human relationships. Our life is short and it's going to come to an end. Each one of us is going to face our Creator, and perhaps He's going to ask us, as He asked Peter, do you love me? Do you want to spend the rest of eternity with me in my presence? Because that's what it's all about. Heaven is living in God's presence for eternity. Is that what you want? If so, what evidence is there that you love me? I think that's what I would say.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, Mr. Stiven, thank you very much indeed. If there's anyone here who would like to find out more, maybe even have a conversation with Chris, or just to find out more about what this is all about, then please do get in contact. Our contact details will be up on the screen at the end of this video. But yeah, if you're a member of this church, then do come up and speak to Chris, and just ask him a few questions. I'm sure he'll be able to tell you more face to face when we can meet again face to face, because we're still in partial lockdown at the moment. And ask him in particular, for example, when most people want to do a 6,000-mile journey, they would jump on a plane. Not Mr. Stiven. If he wants to go from England to Pakistan, then one time he jumped into a camper van and took how long to get there, Chris?
Yeah, we took 28 days on the
28 days.
Journey. Yeah.
Okay, so most people would fly, but anyway, those there's lots more to find out. So I shall leave it. I shall leave it there now. So thank you, Mr. Stiven.
Thank you very much.
I won't shake your hand because that's still against lockdown rules and that. But it's been a pleasure to chat with you, and thank you very much indeed for your time and information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.